So I'm actually a little bit surprised to say this, but the Canon R6, I've now had a really good opportunity to get out and test the camera in multiple different situations, including portrait shoots, weddings, some commercial video work. I thought I'd make a follow-up video to my first impressions, letting you guys know how the camera performs after 1 month of real-world use. To kick things off, here are some of my favorite photos I've been able to take with the Canon R6 over the last 4 weeks. In my opinion, the R5 and the R6 are Canon's first attempt at a professional, top tier, mirrorless full frame camera. The EOS R and the RP were great cameras, but they lacked dual card slots and had a less premium feel in terms of build quality. And they felt a little bit stripped back in terms of the customizable buttons and dials on the camera. The R5 and the R6 take all of the learnings from the EOS R and RP and they just take it to that next level. I'll be talking about the R5 versus the R6 and sort of a comparison between these two cameras a little bit later in the video, but first I want to focus in on what the R6 has to offer. First up, I want to talk about the camera's resolution because a lot of people are talking about this 20.1 megapixel sensor that Canon have started using in the R6. And the reason that that's kind of significant is that it is now the smallest number of megapixels in a Canon full frame mirrorless, because the R has 30 megapixels, the RP has 26, and now the R5 has 45 megapixels. So 20 makes it sort of the bottom rung in terms of resolution. So the resolution is not super high. However, this camera is really tuned to perform in low light. So if you didn't already know, lower megapixel sensors are able to fit larger pixel photo sites on the sensor, which means that they're overall a little bit more sensitive in low light. So I think that the R6 is going to be the best performing Canon mirrorless camera in terms of low light situations. And so far my tests have kind of proven that. I've been able to shoot at very high ISOs and get pretty clean results. And then you also do need to keep in mind the file size. So each raw file coming from the 20 megapixel sensor is very manageable in my opinion. I've shot with high resolution cameras before and the 50 plus megabyte raw files do get a little bit old after a little while, and you start to realize how much that really eats into your storage costs over the long period of time. So if you don't need that extra resolution, and I would argue that not many photographers actually do, it's really reserved for people that are doing a lot of heavy cropping or making extremely large prints, then I think the R6 is a viable option at 20 megapixels. And if you need to crop more than 50% of your photo in order to get your composition right, then I would argue that you should probably be practicing getting your composition, getting your framing right in camera before going out and buying a really high megapixel camera. If you guys want to see for yourself the size of the raw files as well as the compressed RAWs that are coming out of the R6, I'll leave some for you guys to download down below in the description. In high-speed burst mode, the R6 can shoot up to 12 frames per second with the mechanical and electronic first curtain shutter, and up to 20 frames per second with the fully electronic shutter. Personally, I don't have much use for 20 frames per second because I don't really shoot sports or any action or anything like that, but I think 12 frames per second is really nice for capturing that really perfect decisive moment. But also keep in mind that you won't get the full performance of the high-speed burst mode on the R6 unless you're using RF lenses and some EF lenses. And I know Canon have a list of all of the compatible lenses on their website. I also heard that the battery type, because there are 3 different kinds of LPE6 batteries now, there's LPE6, LPE6N, and LPE6NH, the percentage of the battery remaining and the type of battery is also going to affect the high speed frame rate. In terms of dynamic range and exposing the camera, I decided to do a test where I would take a series of RAW files to kind of figure out where is the sweet spot to expose the camera. In previous iterations of Canon cameras, shadow recovery has never been its strong suit. Up until the 1DX Mark II and 5D Mark IV, Canon didn't really have a good reputation for high dynamic range and clean shadow recovery. But the R6 has fantastic shadow recovery, and I would say fairly average highlight recovery. I shot a series of photos at different exposures to test this, starting at 3 stops overexposed, and then 2 stops, 1 stop over, and then metered at exact center. And then I shot 1 stop under, 2 stops underexposed, and finally 3 stops underexposed. At 2 and 3 stops over, we are definitely losing some highlight detail here in this image. But when we go to 1 stop over, we begin to be able to see some good highlight recovery. At center exposure, we can see that almost all of the highlight detail can be brought back and the shadows can be recovered very cleanly. Moving into the underexposure territory, we get great shadow recovery at 1 and 2 stops under with pretty minimal grain, but when we start to go lower than that, we really get some more noticeable fixed pattern noise and color noise as well. So in my opinion, I would hover between exposing in the middle and 1 stop over. I think that's going to give you the best performance in terms of dynamic range. But one piece of advice that I give people is just get to know the camera, try a bunch of different things and see what works best for you. Now moving on to a feature of the R6 that I am definitely most excited about, and that is the dual pixel autofocus 2. When you're comparing the R to the R6, I think this new dual pixel autofocus system is really the silver bullet. This is the one feature that's going to make it an absolute no-brainer to go for the R6. So I did a test with my friend Amanda and I had her walk toward the camera and I fired off a series of shots in servo autofocus with the eye tracking on. And as you can see, it did not miss a single frame. So absolute 100% focus accuracy across the 3 times that I had Amanda walk towards the camera. Even just watching the box follow her face in the frame before even looking at the raw files, I knew it would be an improvement over the R. It's almost like the camera knows where Amanda is going to walk next. It's really impressive. And the best thing is it's not even limited to the RF lenses either. The focus performance is exactly the same on my Tamron 35mm 1.4 SP and the 50mm 1.8 from Canon as well. Even in video mode, the autofocus tracking was very surprising. The visual feedback on the screen, watching that focus box moving in real time is actually really impressive. I have noticed in low light, object tracking is nowhere near as good in the video mode. This is a big downside as well. Face tracking seems to work fine, but with objects or areas, it constantly drifts and the box shifts around the frame randomly sometimes. So just keep that in mind when you're shooting in darker situations. The camera feels great in the hand, very comfortable, even for someone with bigger hands. It's much less bulky than your traditional professional DSLR without being uncomfortably small. I'm glad that Canon didn't try to make these cameras as compact as the R and RP, because to me, this is the perfect size and comfort trade-off. Things I like about the design, the joystick for sure is a welcome addition. It makes navigating the camera much easier, and the wheel on the back that was inherited from the 5D and 6D line of cameras is great also. So that wheel on the back in combination with the 2 dials on top of the camera mean that you can change your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO without having to press any additional buttons. The rate button, I love this feature and I really missed it on the EOS R. So for those that don't know, you can actually star the images in the camera and those star ratings are written to the metadata of the file, which means they appear in Lightroom after you import the photos. Often after a shoot, I'll have the client or the model go through the camera and hit the rate button on the photos that they love, and that way I know which photos to definitely include in the final delivery. The only button that you could assign to rate images on the EOS R was the multi-function touch bar, and that was super annoying. Sometimes you would accidentally press it when you're reviewing images and you would rate some photos that are kind of throwaway and then they'd make it into the final catalog. So I'm really stoked to have a dedicated button on the R6. I already touched on this in my first impressions video, but the amount of customization that you can have with the buttons and dials is much improved on the R5 and R6. If you want to see how I customize the camera for photography so that I can quickly change my focus mode and get to where I need to go in a hurry, I've already made that video. So if you're a new owner of an R6, I highly recommend you go and check that video out, as it goes through all of the different ways you can customize the layout of the camera to your liking. So as I mentioned earlier, the R6 now has dual card slots, and this is a really massive feature for anybody who likes to have an instant backup of your photos as you're shooting. So if you're shooting something that can only happen once, like a wedding, it is nice to have an instant backup in case of your SD card failing. Now it is rare, it doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen. And talking about the choice of media, I do really like that the R6 uses SD cards and not the newer formats of compact flash. I've already got SD cards laying around and they are fast enough to record the 4K video. So I'm really happy that I don't have to spend more money on newer, more expensive card formats. So in terms of shooting video, in my tests you can get away with using a V30 card, such as the UHS-1 SanDisk Extreme Pro with the 95 megabit per second rating for recording modes, even up to the 4K 60p in the 10-bit mode. I've been using them for video now for a month with no issues at all. But the best cards to use for the video functions and the 20 frames per second high burst rates are going to be the V60 UHS-2 cards. I do recommend this one as it will be able to handle those high frame rate bursts at the full uncompressed RAW, and the V30 is cutting it a bit fine in terms of data rate for the 4K 60p 10-bit, so just to be safe, I do recommend picking up the V60 card. In my opinion, the V90 cards are a little bit overkill. You don't really need them for the 4K recording modes. So by now we're all aware of the overheating problems that the R5 and the R6 have when it comes to shooting 4K video. And in my opinion, if you are looking for a camera that's going to be able to shoot 4K for long periods of time, back-to-back clips, you're shooting all day, I would not recommend getting an R5 or an R6, but instead I would go for a more serious professional video camera such as the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 6K, or if you need autofocus, something like a C200. To me, the R6 is more of a photo-centric camera that can shoot really high quality 4K, but only here and there, and that's how it fits into my camera bag. The one thing that surprised me most, even more than the insane 4K 10-bit 422 quality coming out of the R6, is the sharpness and clarity of the 1080p image. The first time I reviewed the 1080 footage from the R6, I thought I'd actually made a mistake and accidentally recorded in 4K. The 1080p is some of the sharpest that I've ever seen coming out of a mirrorless camera. I shot some side-by-side tests with the 4K and 1080p and see if you can tell the difference. To the trained eye, of course, you'll be able to see a slight bump in detail with the 4K, but for me, if I needed to drop to 1080 during a shoot to circumvent the overheating, I wouldn't be that upset about it. In my opinion, the 100 frames per second and 120 FPS in the R6 leaves a lot to be desired. It has terrible moire patterns and it's not sharp, very mushy overall. It's a good thing that I hardly ever use 120 frames per second. Comparing it to the 120 and even the 240 in the Fuji X-T4, the Canon is nowhere near as good. So how does the R6 fit in with the current lineup of full-frame Canon mirrorless cameras? I would say that the R6 sits comfortably above the EOS R because of its new dual pixel autofocus system and also the in-body image stabilization. Not to mention the addition of 4K uncropped recording as well as that 422 10-bit, which I really like. The autofocus system, in my opinion, is really the biggest improvement though. Those features in combination with the customizability of the camera, the dual card slots, it kind of makes it a no-brainer to go for the R6 over the R if you can afford it. I do see the R6 as a worthy upgrade over the R and the RP. Even though you are getting a drop in megapixels, you're gaining so much more in the handling and reliability of the camera. That's not to say that the RP and the R aren't great cameras, they really are. It's just that Canon has really taken a big step up with the R5 and the R6. I chose the R6 over the R5 based solely on the fact that for the extra cost, the bump in megapixels and those extra video recording modes weren't really worth it to me. I'm actually a little bit surprised to say this, but the Canon R6 is my favorite camera that I've ever used so far. It honestly makes shooting feel pretty effortless. Thanks to that shockingly good focusing system, the forgiving dynamic range, and the improved handling of the camera body overall, this camera actually gets out of my way, and that's what you want out of a camera. You want it to guide you towards producing amazing images, and not to act like a hurdle to your creativity. This camera actually obliterated my expectations, and it's a shame that it got a lot of negative press due to the overheating, which I will say is greatly exacerbated mainly by the majority of camera YouTubers and reviewers focusing too heavily on the video specs of what is actually a stills camera. But I think this camera will go on to be somewhat of a cult favorite amongst not just YouTubers, but real professional photographers that are working in the field. Anyway, that's it for me, guys. Any questions that you might have, anything that I didn't touch on that you want to know about, please leave it down in the comments section below. I try to get back to as many people as I can. So thanks for sticking around for the entire video, guys. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.